everyone, this is your weekly look back at the world that was some 30 years ago, and I'm your very old host, Dave. Seriously, I feel my joints tightening up as I read this. Anyway, enough about me. Today we are definitely looking at some of the older content that we're going to see on Zilog and Moto with a game from the early days of the Master System. It doesn't get much earlier than this when it comes to 8-bit Sega unless you're talking about the SG-1000, and we're not, because I'm not a millionaire that can afford to collect games from a console that was never released in the United States. I'd like to, for completeness sake, though. I think it could be fun to compare, say, the choplifter that the SG-1000 got versus the one for the Master System that we look back at episode 47. But let's be honest, I've got enough trouble trying to track down the rare titles that are in my list already. Today's game I actually found relatively recently at one of the locations of Disc Replay around my area. I don't find a lot of Master System titles in the wild anymore, as I've already picked up a lot of the more common ones that were released in the United States, but I still keep an eye out just in case. And what I found was Astro Warrior, specifically in the combo cartridge form with Hang-On. Now, for those of you paying attention at home and other people who just happen to know Master System release history, you might be thinking, wait a minute, I thought Hang-On was part of a combo cartridge with Safari Hunt as a pack-in for the Master System. Well, it was, and I actually covered that already on Zilog and Moto back in episode 16, which features a review of both Hang-On and Safari Hunt if you're curious. Short version, Hang-On, good. Safari Hunt, eh. So why is it in a combo cartridge with Hang-On? Honestly, I don't know. Hang-On never had a solo release in the United States. It was either on a combo cartridge with Safari Hunt or this release with Astro Warrior. Astro Warrior was released as a solo title in the United States, so if I was being a completist, I'd probably pick that up as well, but I'm going to be honest, I don't really care that much. Maybe if I find it dirt cheap at one of these days at like a show or something. But to make things even more screwy, while Astro Warrior got dual releases in the United States, in Europe it only appeared as a combo cartridge release with Pit Pot, not Hang-On, which was instead released as a solo title on Sega carts. Oh, and Pit Pot? Never released in the United States, so to get an English language copy, you'll have to import that Astro Warrior Pit Pot combo cartridge. Or, I will, since that's one of the titles I don't have yet. Yeah, definitely don't need 3 copies of Astro Warrior hanging around. So, after all that, what is Astro Warrior? Well, Astro Warrior is a vertical shooter, and at first glance, you might think it's just Sega's Galaga clone. That's what I thought anyway, before booting up the game for the first time. But, thankfully I can say that is not correct, and calling it a Galaga clone is definitely an insult. There is some game here, a lot more than I was expecting, and definitely puts Astro Warrior in the camp of don't judge a book by its cover. Or in Astro Warrior's case, don't judge a game from the size of its ROM. As you can tell by my reaction so far, my opinion on Astro Warrior is definitely favorable, but I don't want to step on the rest of the review too much, so you'll just have to watch to see how favorable. So, without further ado, let's get to it. But first, our customary look at the package, which in this case is the Hang-On Astro Warrior combo cart.
And here is this specific version of Astro Warrior, the Hang-On and Astro Warrior combo cartridge, as you can clearly see by both names and the blue The Combo cartridge label that's on the front and on the spine. I've mentioned this before when I've looked at some of the other combo cartridge games, and these really stand out when you have them on your shelf because of that spine. At least if you've got a bunch of US games rather than later European and Brazilian releases, because mostly you'll have an ocean of white, and then you'll have these in pretty stark contrast, which is a good thing, because all those pre-1990 titles just look so boring otherwise. It's like looking at a bunch of hardcover books without the dust jacket, where you can't tell what anything is on the shelf until you get right up on it. Back to the front cover though, and this is fine. There are certainly a lot worse examples out there, and I actually include the solo Astro Warrior release in that list. I'll superimpose it here real quick so you can compare the two in real time. The actual graphic they chose for the cover isn't bad. I actually like the shot of the Astro Warrior ship destroying one of the motherships. But why is it all the way over to the left? So then you're left with a ton of empty space on the right, and the only reason I can think of for that is because the Sega logo that's in the bottom right hand corner of both versions. It just looks really weird and totally unbalanced, and I find it hard to believe they couldn't do better than that. By comparison, this combo cartridge release is at least balanced on the front and does feature both the Hang-On and Astro Warrior designs. From a condition perspective, again, this copy is okay, but it's definitely seen better days. The outer cover is fully intact, and although it's a bit scuffed up in places, and has a few nicks around the spine. The hang tab is intact at the top, which is especially nice considering this copy is creeping up on 35 years of age. Seriously, it's not that much younger than me. The inner cover looks pretty good at first glance, but when you look a little closer, especially down on the bottom edge, it's a bit worn and stained, so I'm guessing it had some liquid spilled on it at some point, but it could be far worse. Flipping over the back, and we've got the standard 1986 format for the back of Master System titles, with 2 screenshots at the top and flavor text down below. In this case, one shot from Hang-On and one from Astro Warrior. Both screenshots are good quality, and I like the tagline at the top. Twice the action, twice the risk, one incredible combination. Just sounds intense. Unfortunately, it falters a bit down below in the Astro Warrior section. You can only count on yourself to shoot fast, to shoot straight. If you do, you get more power, more weapons, to beat the villains, to beat the odds. If you don't, the odds beat you. If that sequence was any more William Shatner, it'd be on the back cover of a Tech War novel. Yikes. Opening up the case, and both the cartridge and the manual are in fantastic shape. Not perfect, mind you, but far better than I was expecting after seeing how the outside of the case looked. And keep in mind, the way the case looks is actually cleaned up a bit from when I first got it. But I'm definitely impressed with how good this manual looks. It's not mint, but it hasn't seen much wear and tear at all. I'm assuming it's spent most of its 35-year life in the case without even being touched. Unfortunately, the manual's contents leave a bit to be desired, at least from an Astro Warrior perspective. It's a 14-page manual, and a grand total of 3 pages are dedicated to Astro Warrior, with one of those 3 being 2 screenshots for the game. Now, I know there's not exactly a lot that needs to be explained here, but come on, man. And before you think that I've got a condensed version of the manual because it's the combo cartridge version rather than the solo one, there's only one redundant page that's been excised. Oh well, it's not the end of the world. Well, I think that's more than enough about all that. Let's get into the game and see just how much fun blowing up alien ships can be. For the simpler games in the Master System catalog, it's tough to put together a decent length review. In some cases, there's just simply not enough going on in the game to talk about it for more than a certain amount of words. I've gotten in the habit of trying to aim for 20 minutes in each of these videos, because I think that's a good length to fully discuss each game without getting too detailed, or leaving out important features. Why am I bringing this up in the Astro Warrior review? Am I merely trying to stretch for time to pad the length of the video? Yeah, I could see being accused of that, but there actually is a point I'm trying to make here, and that's directly related to the simplicity of the game. From just a pure reality perspective, the smaller a game's ROM, the simpler a game is, by and large. If you want to have a more complex game filled with oohs and ahs, you need more ROM space to hold the graphics and sound. This is why we all had the bragging on the 16-bit era about cartridge size, with titles like Strider emphasizing that they were 8 megabit in a huge label on the cover. This also fueled the labeling of some of the earlier Master System titles with either the Mega Cartridge or 2 Mega Cartridge, referencing just how much ROM was on the cartridge you were buying. Nowadays, size for games is less important in reference to how good a game is, and in fact, due to limited space available to install games on console hard drives, you end up with the opposite, where games like the recently released Call of Duty Black Ops Cold War have been derided for taking up too much space, with that game weighing in at an absolutely massive almost 1/4 terabyte. Astro Warrior, on the other hand, is much closer to 1/8 of a megabyte. Think about that for a second. In a period of 35 years, marquee console games have grown in size 2 million times. And you can get that number up to 8 million if you take into consideration that Sega card-sized titles like Hang-On only came in at 32 kilobytes. It's hard to say exactly how much space Astro Warrior takes up, but the Hang-On and Astro Warrior combo cartridge that we're looking at today weighs in at 1 megabit, so if you subtract the 1/4 megabit that Hang-On takes up, then Astro Warrior is no larger than 3/4 of a megabit. Okay, well enough with all that math. This is a game review, not algebra, thank God. Why did I go into all that detail? Well, to emphasize that this is not only a small game, but a game released early in the Master System's lifespan in late 1986. And we've looked at a few early, not-so-large games for the Master System so far, such as Marksman Shooting and Trap Shooting, or Hang On and Safari Hunt previously on the channel. And of those titles, only really Hang On stood out, with its clear derivation from the arcade original. However, even Hang On, well, it's kinda thin. To be fair to it, you definitely have to look at it through a 1986 lens. Astro Warrior, on the other hand, and yes, I'm finally talking about the game itself, is a great game today. There's a lot of debate that goes on with gamers about what games hold up or what games stand the test of time. Some games, like any music or film or other artistic mediums, just don't hold up over the years. During their day, when they were all you had, they were fine, and actually a lot of the work that I do writing these reviews involves me trying to put myself in the mindset of how I would feel if I was playing this game in whatever year it came out, especially versus whatever other games were also available at the time. For Astro Warrior, I don't have to do that, and when I do, it makes the game all that more impressive, especially in regards to my earlier essay on the game's limited ROM footprint. So, where do I start with Astro Warrior? Well, how about what it is versus what it's not? I mentioned earlier that comparing the game directly to something like Galaga does disservice to Astro Warrior. When you get down to basics, both games would be considered vertical shooters. However, Galaga, like Space Invaders before it, is more of what I'm going to call a wave shooter, in that at the start of a level, you're placed on a screen where you feel somewhat stationary, although you can move back and forth, and everything moves around you. Astro Warrior is different. While both games take place in the darkness of space, Astro Warrior places you in a level where you're constantly moving forward in an environment, with a feel like a modern vertical shooter, closer to something like, say, Raiden. And I'm sure there's probably a better comparison of Astro Warrior to something else in its time period, as there's a pretty big jump between those two games, but I'm drawing a blank right now. Probably its closest direct comparison at the time was Capcom's 1942 port for the NES, that was also released in the Christmas season of 1986. And it's comparisons like that that absolutely drive me crazy with how much more successful the NES was than the Master System, because Astro Warrior stomps an absolute mudhole in 1942's chest and walks it dry. I think one of the things I'm most impressed by in Astro Warrior is how much it does with so little. For instance, Astro Warrior only has two backgrounds, either a starry black sky, which is used for most of the levels, or a dead black screen used during the boss fights. They both work well as far as the game is concerned, and Sega went with a wise decision of having the starry background have each of the pixels for the stars change color as the game moves, making the game seem more lifelike than just having a bunch of plain white pixels in the background. As you move through each of the levels, portions of the level will feature you flying over a large mothership that effectively serves as a background as well. And while these ships are much too large for you to destroy, there are plenty of targets on the ship for you to take out and boost your score while shooting and avoiding waves of other smaller ships. It's hard to play these sequences and not think of the attacks in Star Wars on the Super Star Destroyers, and I'm sure those scenes were a large influence on the game developers. Another thing that I'm always impressed by when playing Master System games, especially in comparison to NES titles, is the use of color. I already mentioned how much I like the stars in the background not being static, but all the enemies in Astro Warrior are very colorful as well, and there's a nice mix in each level, so it's not like you're just shooting the same boring spaceships all the time. Again, think of something like 1942, it's just wave after wave of the same boring airplanes. Astro Warrior instead features some very creative ship designs, and along with having multiple types of enemies during a level, it actually changes the enemies up as you progress, with enemies appearing in level 2 that didn't appear in the first level, etc. And each level in Astro Warrior features a large, colorful boss at the end to take out, and I do mean large, with especially the second and third bosses taking up a good third of the screen. And all this action is presented with smooth, steady frame rate, with no slowdown and only very minimal flickering, as the game is subject to the usual Master System flaw of having problems when too many enemies are on the same line. But the game specifically doesn't have too many instances of this occurring, probably on purpose. As much as I'm impressed by the game's graphics, its sound needs to be called out as well. Each level has its own background track, and they're all great, with upbeat tempos that match the frenetic action on screen. There's special boss music, and the intro has its own theme as well. I imagine if you were to sit down and play the game for hours and hours, it might get a bit old, but I thought it was all awesome, especially for an early Master System title. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to find credits for who did the soundtrack, but they outdid themselves. The sound effects serve the game as well. There's not that many of them, but they all sound of decent quality and properly match the on-screen action. The sound was definitely not just a second thought with Astro Warrior. Astro Warrior's gameplay is a bit more of a double-edged sword as opposed to the graphics and sound. On the positive side, when I referenced Raiden earlier, what I was specifically referring to was the presence of in-game power-ups for your ship. This is mentioned in the manual, but it's one of those situations where, yeah, okay, they mentioned it, but it really probably should have had at least a page explaining it, and perhaps some screenshots or drawings of the power-ups, so you'd know what to be looking for. Regardless, there's three main types of power-ups for your ship. Power-ups that allow you to make your shots more powerful, power-ups that increase the speed of your ship, and power-ups that add satellites to your ship for even more firepower. The power-up system really makes this game feel like a modern vertical shooter, and are part of what helps the game still hold up in comparison to other titles. As far as firing is concerned, the game doesn't feature a built-in rapid fire, but if your controller supports it, it's definitely helpful. And before you accuse me of cheating, Sega even recommended the sports pad when playing the game due to its rapid fires feature. On the negative side, Astro Warrior is relatively short, with the game only consisting of 3 levels, and when you get good at the game, you can run through all 3 levels in about 10 minutes or so. Fun fact, this Astro Warrior version, meaning the one in the Hang-On combo cartridge, ends after 3 runs through the levels, while the standalone or pit pod versions run endlessly for high score purposes. Astro Warrior is definitely just a title that you'll only pull out periodically and play for a few hours, versus spend a lot of time on, but I think that's okay, especially for a shooter. All in all, I'm giving Astro Warrior 3 stars. As great as the game is on a whole, the short length is definitely an issue and loses it a star. If this game had, say, 5 levels instead of 3, it would definitely be a 4-star candidate. If you had any doubts about how good this game is, just go watch 5 minutes of 1942 footage from the NES, without muting the video. I dare you.
Okay, that was Astro Warrior, and I've said this before about other titles, but this is one of those games that really makes doing this channel enjoyable. I never would have expected this game to be as good as it is. It was so good and surprising, I actually had to call my son into the room and come play it for a bit just to see someone else's reaction to it. Definitely a nice return after last week's disappointment in Coffee Crisis. Speaking of that Coffee Crisis video, something amazing happened last week. It did really great numbers throughout the week, becoming the second most viewed video I've uploaded in the first 2 seasons of Zilog and Moto. And Zilog and Moto's subscriber base increased 10%. And I mention this not to brag, but to say thank you. All the people that came in from Sega 16, SMS Power, Reddit, wherever, I really appreciate all of you, and you gave me a nice early Thanksgiving gift with that one. Next week on Zilog and Moto, yet another game I've never played before on the Genesis. Sort of. It's a port of a very, very famous arcade machine that started an entire franchise that goes to 11 currently. Full disclosure, I've played that arcade machine, but the Genesis version is a blank slate for me, so I'll be very interested to see how it compares. Remember, whatever you like to play, have fun, and be excellent to each other. Later.